Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And we're very blessed to have with us Joseph P. Farrell. You can visit Joseph's website at GizaDeathStar.com. You can email Joseph Farrell at this address, Vardis3@AOL.com. And that's Vardis, V is in Victor, A-R, D is in David, A-S, but the number 3 at AOL.com. And if you do email Joseph, be sure that whatever you put in the subject line of your email is in capital letters. Joseph Farrell is truly a brilliantly gifted researcher. He is an extremely prolific author dealing with very deep subjects. He holds a doctorate in patristics from the University of Oxford and has published 4 previous works, all on theology. Joseph recently moved back to his home state in South Dakota, where he pursues research on other loves and hobbies, namely classical music. He is an organist. He plays the harpsichord and composes classical music. He's deeply involved in physics, alternative history, and science, and out-of-the-box thinking. Thank God. We have a true, gifted, out-of-the-box thinker in Joseph P. Farrell. And the books he has written, The Giza Death Star, The Giza Death Star Deployed, The Giza Death Star Destroyed, Reich of the Black Sun, The SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and also The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. And you can order those books, and I would suggest you get all of them. You can order them from Adventures Unlimited Press, toll free. Call 1-800-718-4514. That's 1-800-718-4514. And also, Adventures Unlimited Press has a 24-hour credit card ordering line, and you can call that 1-815-253-6390. That's 815-253-6390. And Joseph and I are talking about Lucifer and other related topics. And if this were in the series, this particular file would be number 9. If it were in the Cosmic War series. Joseph, with Lucifer, okay, he lost some of his stones, correct?
Right.
Okay. We could interpret that as technology. Okay. These stones gave him his covering.
Well, they, as far as I can tell from my reading of the text, and let's kind of refresh your listeners' memory here. The text I'm referring to would be in the book of Ezekiel. I cited in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, and the text refers to stones on his crown that he lost. And there's an ancient esoteric tradition that refers to this, that refers to the stone of exile, or the lapis exilis, as it's called in the Latin, that he lost when he fell. So it has something to do, I believe, if we put it in the wider context of the same type of power objects that we find in the Sumerian text, where stones are objects of power and objects particularly of a technology involved in some sort of horrendous weaponry. If this be the case, if that reading is correct, then Lucifer's stones appeared to give him some sort of hegemony over various aspects of creation, or various regions of it. It's very difficult to tell from the text, but this seems to be what's in play.
Well, with his little visit there in the garden. Okay, and before that, we have these two accounts of creation stories.
Right.
And that has been viewed by some people as two accounts written by two different
people, correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How do you view that?
Oh, I don't at all. That whole theory began to emerge in the 18th century. The man who first formulated the idea that the names of God, Yahweh in the second creation account, and then Elohim in Genesis chapter 1, were the basis probably of two separate creation accounts, was an 18th century French doctor by the name of Jean Ostruc. And this idea was picked up on big time in Germany, where it eventually evolved a very complex hypothesis. It's called the documentary hypothesis, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis, where you have four different source documents that are called J, E, D, and P in the literature concerning this theory, that were used by later editors to compile the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Sometimes this is also called source criticism in the literature, but it's a vast, huge academic theory. This is the type of biblical scholarship that one would learn if one went to a modern seminary or Department of Religious Studies in a secular university. This is the reigning academic theory. There are a number of problems with it that Christian scholars, particularly in the Protestant evangelical camp, have pointed out over a number of years, and they're quite correct in doing so. Basically, it boils down to the fact that ultimately these so-called source documents are really not recoverable from the text. In other words, they've exceeded the evidence itself in order to construct the theory. So I'm not one of those that subscribes to the idea that the Old Testament really shows signs of two separate creation accounts. I think what we have between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is the same story, essentially being told from two very different points of view in terms of the theological content that they're trying to convey. The first one is simply trying to outline the creation itself, and then the second one is focused more upon man's relationship to the rest of creation. It's a kind of a literary device, actually, that was very typical for ancient societies and for the ancient Hebrews to employ. So I don't think that we're dealing with two separate creation accounts. The other thing that this theory, this documentary hypothesis, was really designed to do in the hands of some of these critics was it was designed to overturn Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And in doing so, really what's at stake is the genuine or general historicity of what's contained in them. So, in effect, when they reconstructed what they thought to be the origin of the Old Testament, they were, in effect, rewriting the entire history of the Israelites, and doing so in such a way that would push most of the significant events that are referred to in the Old Testament, like the Exodus and so on, it would either completely mythologize them or push them to a period much later and much more toward our own time in history. And this I think just makes just makes complete hash out of the whole thing, you know. So no, I'm not a subscriber to it.
Okay. You know, I'm backing up here from
Sure.
Lucifer, trying to set a little bit of a stage here.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. In Genesis 1, or Genesis 2, let us create man in our image.
Mm-hmm.
And people say, okay, well, who's us and who's our?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Is he talking to his heavenly hosts, or what? Well,
there are within biblical scholarship and within in traditional theology, there are a variety of answers to that question. The Hebrew term that's translated God there is Elohim, and the ending, the I am ending on that particular word is in Hebrew grammar a plural. And in Hebrew you have singulars, you have duals, in other words, endings that refer to two people, and then you have three or more. So that's a three or more ending, okay? Excuse me.
Well, doesn't it use, in the beginning, Elohim?
Yes.
So we've got, what, the gods?
Well, this is like I say, there are some traditional readings, and then we'll get into these alternative ones.
Okay.
One of the traditional readings is that Elohim is kind of a plural of royalty. Okay, like you will hear a monarch, you know, in official documents, they will use we instead of I. You know, the famous surrender treaty of the Russians to Imperial Germany in World War I. If you've looked at that document, in very large letters, it says Wir Wilhelm. In other words, we, William, Emperor of Germany, and so on and so forth. So that's the royal we, and that's what some scholars think is in use here, some variation of a royal usage, that it's not a real plural, it's a plural of royalty, okay?
Kind of like we the people?
Kind of like we the people, right,
okay.
Exactly. It's God's using, or God is being referred to in the royal we. Okay. And incidentally, you know, this is the form of English that the King James deliberately preserves long after it had dropped out of customary usage in ordinary speech, you know, with the these and the thous, which are actually familiar address, and then you, which is actually a singular or a plural of royalty or a normal plural. So this kind of is in play. The other reading, the other interpretation that you find in some early church fathers, John Chrysostom and people of this sort, is that Elohim is being used there to refer to the Trinity. Okay, that's the we, that's the plural. Other commentators see in it that God is addressing the angelic hosts. You know, we are going to go down and do this, rather than we, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are going to go down and do this. So those are the standard readings. Now, within alternative literature, the interpretation is often advanced that this is really the council of the sons of God that are referred to later in Scripture. That, in other words, these are angels that are acting as the direct agents here of creation, and this oftentimes is advanced in terms of the so-called gap theory, where if you look at Jeremiah, I think, and again, I'm probably foggy here on the chapter, but I think it's chapter 4. It refers to a period when the creation was void, that there were cities, there were birds, and so on and so forth, but clearly it refers to a period prior to the creation in Genesis.
Right.
And so that led to the so-called gap theory, that there was an initial creation by God, that there was an actual civilization that was then built or progressed during that period, and then it fell apart, and then the creation in Genesis is the repairing of that creation, and hence you have the involvement of the angels in doing this. So it's rather complex, but that basically is kind of the standard alternative take on it. I think in terms of kind of speculating a bit on the lines that we've taken in the previous discussions, I think that this whole idea of the gap theory needs perhaps to be explored more extensively again, because in terms of some of the things and scenarios that I've written about in the books, it does make sense.
Okay, elaborate a little more on this.
Well, in the Cosmic War, as you know, I postulate that there was this interplanetary civilization that went to war, blew up a planet, and it did so, if the dates in the texts are any indicator, approximately 3.2 to 3.4 million years ago, if not much older or much farther back in history than that. And as a result of that war, the civilization itself that had existed there was all but wiped out. But as a further consequence of that war, the local celestial mechanics, in other words, creation itself, was fundamentally broken in a certain way. And you find references in the ancient Sumerian texts that shortly after the conclusion of this war, the Babylonian god Marduk, and I'm quoting the text here, remeasures the structure of the deep. In other words, looks at and re-examines the resulting geometry of local space and what had happened as a result of the war. Now, that sort of scenario fits very well with this gap theory of there being an initial creation, a civilization that followed it, that then, so to speak, in terms of the scenario, blew itself apart, and then everything had to be repaired. This is the sort of thing I mean. I think we might have to re-examine the gap theory in terms of its possible conjunction with or being another detail about this cosmic war scenario.
In other words, it altered the fabric of space.
Right. It you know, when you blow up a planet, what that does is it changes the geometrical and gravitational signature of local space rather significantly. And as a result, it changes the mechanics of everything else in that system that was there to begin with. You know, in the original exploded planet hypothesis that Dr. Tom Van Flandern advanced, Mars was a satellite of that planet, and as a result of the explosion, it was released on this very weird eccentric orbit that it has today. So in other words, the mechanics, as you say, the geometry changed and had to be understood and remeasured. And to quite literally, you know, if you're going to have a war of that nature and blow a civilization apart to that extent, you're not only going to have to do that, but you're going to have literally to rebuild. First of all, you're going to have to preserve the elements of your civilization that you want to be preserved, and secondly, you're going to have to rebuild. So all of this appears to square somewhat with this whole idea of a gap theory that's been around for some number of years.
Now, was God involved in this war? Or do we know?
Well, in terms of the scenario I'm advancing, not directly. Because you don't see the types of what I would call moral implications to the Sumerian text that you do in the biblical texts.
Right.
This isn't to say that he wasn't, but it is to say that perhaps it was not of the same sort of direct nature that you find operating in the Old Testament itself. He may have been, and if we plug this whole gap scenario and this whole fall of Lucifer scenario into the cosmic war, then quite clearly, yes, he is directly involved. But it remains to be seen whether that plugging in should even be done, and that's what I'm talking about. We need to go back and re-examine some of these ideas that have been floating around within Christian theology for quite some time, and re-examine them very seriously to see if perhaps they do fit, if this is perhaps all part of an even bigger, grander scenario.
Well, it certainly is a fascinating one.
Oh, yes, it is.
Okay, which do we know, for example, the the source, is it Deuteronomist? Is it Yahwist? The two different creation stories. Do we know where they came from?
Well, in terms of that theory, there are a number of things that have been advanced, but the clearest and most widely accepted idea within that school of biblical criticism is that the Deuteronomist source was actually more or less the book of Deuteronomy, which was then discovered by King Josiah in his reforms circa the year 621 BC. And everything in the theory, in terms of its chronological reconstruction, is more or less fastened around that event. So that's at least one source. The others are more conjectural in terms of that theory. Depending on which version of the theory you read, and that's the other problem with it. The theory keeps changing depending on which period of history you're examining that it evolves in. In some versions, the Yahwist source is the earliest source, but in other versions, it's the latest source. And that really is kind of the version of the theory that ultimately holds sway within biblical scholarship. In terms of the gap theory, it really isn't germane to the theory itself to assign a possible source to it, because the theory really deals more with the grand issues of creation itself than particular sources.
Okay. God is talking to someone, and he says, let us create.
Right.
In our image.
In our image.
Okay. Us and our indicate plural.
Mm-hmm, right.
Someone said at one time that other races created other races.
Right.
Okay. And that's always been a perplexing thing.
Right.
And it's rarely ever spoken of.
Right.
And when we look at the white man and how he is castigated and hated, especially nowadays, where would that have come from?
Well, let's go back for a moment to these traditional views, and I mentioned that most of the early church fathers viewed that us statement, creating man in our image and our likeness, to the Trinity, because, and to me this is a very profound way of interpreting that passage, because in order to have a doctrine of the Trinity, you have to have that all-important distinction that we mentioned previously between person and nature. Okay? So the doctrine of the Trinity is that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three absolutely irreducible, concrete uniquenesses, three persons, okay? With one nature, okay? Now, in terms of creating humanity then, the Eastern Church Fathers have always seen the analogies of God within man to be precisely due to the fact that mankind himself is a multi-personal, one-nature entity. In other words, we all share the common human nature, but we are all very, very different, unique persons.
Right.
Okay? And that's how they interpret the image of God in man, as in direct reference to the Trinity. Now that's interesting because in the Western Church, it was precisely the other way around due to the influence of St. Augustine of Hippo, who interpreted the Trinitarian analogies as being located within each individual human person, and the analogies of their will, memory, and soul, and so on and so forth. So in the Western Church, it became a purely psychological and, so to speak, self-centered emphasis. In the Eastern Church, it became a sociological emphasis. See the difference there?
Okay.
Rather than looking at oneself, one had to look out of oneself in order to understand the analogy. Okay? That's a big, huge difference, and it plays a big, huge role in the respective differences of spirituality within those two traditions. So my inclination would be to interpret it precisely that way. But now let's explore the alternative explanation, that other races are involved in the creation of mankind, because this is precisely what you see in the Sumerian texts. They are very clear in their reference to the fact that modern humanity was a deliberately genetically engineered alteration of some pre-existing hominid or humanoid life form.
They talk about the blackheads.
Yes, they talk about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And the alteration occurs precisely by some mixing in with this primitive hominid, some mixing in of their own genetic structure to create essentially what for them was a slave species. So if we look at things that way, if we credit that source or that story with truth, then it does raise some profound theological questions, because it would mean that modern mankind is a deliberately engineered species. So why then do we have the subsequent biblical prohibitions and restrictions on doing precisely that sort of thing? My guess is, if that reading is true, and again I'm not saying it is, but just exploring the theological implications of it, if it is true, then any subsequent modification is really something that more or less destroys that original creation. In other words, if God can work through evolution, as some theologians maintain, then it's equally possible that he might work through a direct genetic engineering and creation of humanity. But once that is done, that is the species that, so to speak, has his seal of approval, and any further modification or alteration is perforce going to lead to evil things.
Oh, yeah.
So, I don't discount the possibility, but what I'm saying is that again is one of those very, very complex theological problems that, if true, we are going to have to go back to the drawing board and rethink some very basic things about biblical statements about mankind being in the image and likeness of God, and so on and so forth. I don't think it changes any fundamental spiritual thing, but I do think it changes some of our view of history.
Sure.
The other thing that I should mention that emerges from those ancient Sumerian texts is, even though they make it clear that mankind is a hybrid species, they also make it clear that almost immediately upon his creation, attempts were made by beings, so to speak, in the Sumerian pantheon to marry into it. So you find the peculiar situation, if you reconstruct the genealogies that I've outlined in the Cosmic War, you find explanations for, Adam and Eve having other children. But these other children that are not mentioned in the Bible are precisely from these ultra-hybridized lines. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, the Old Testament Nephilimic activity is pushed back into a time frame that is almost commensurate with the creation of mankind himself. It exists from the beginning. And that poses a very interesting dynamic, because you see a hybrid line emerging from Adam and some of these Sumerian gods. You see a hybrid line emerging from Eve and some of these Sumerian gods. And then you have a purely human line emerging from Adam and Eve. So humanity, in terms of the Sumerian way of looking at things, is poised in this very precarious situation between two halves of this huge pantheonic house that's been warring with each other for such a long time. So, take it for what it's worth, whatever that means. But, if true, again, it puts the biblical account of things in a very interesting context from which to be read.
Well, it certainly does. And
Oh, yes.
I've read a lot of, Noah Kramer's work on the Sumerian text. Whoa, there's some interesting things in there.
Oh, yes, there are. And, whether we like it or not, the more we progress scientifically, specifically in terms of physics and genetics and biology, the more those texts take on the tone of reality, because what is written about in them can so easily be paralleled to certain developments in those sciences today. So, I think inevitably, just as a matter of simple Christian apologetics, that theologians are going to have to deal with these issues, whether or not they believe they are true, or in other words, really happened. They're simply going to have to deal with them from the standpoint of, well, what if they were true? What do we make of it? What do we think this means in terms of the development of the Jewish and Christian traditions? So, this again is a huge work remaining to be done. And I don't see anyone with really good, solid traditional theological credentials out there doing it.
Right. Well, it's a hot topic.
It's a hot topic.
Nobody wants to touch that hot potato.
It's such an extraordinarily hot potato. There are. I put so many allusions to these issues in the Cosmic War, and did so very deliberately. But I did not comment extensively theologically on them at all. And again, that is because the foundation to do so has to be prepared so very carefully, because it touches upon so many different aspects of Christian history and doctrine that it's not even funny. And to do so lightly then would really be to make very short shrift of the issues.
Well, there is an ongoing and increasing attack against the white male.
Yes.
And it's pretty hard to understand. I mean,
well, it's from the mythological point of view, it's fairly easy to understand, because you have traditions from all over the world. The Japanese have their legends of the Ainu and the Yamato people, which is a white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, bearded group of people that come down and teach the early Japanese civilization. Well, you can go to Central America and the legends of Quetzalcoatl, and you find, again, Quetzalcoatl is referred to as white-skinned, blonde-haired, or red-haired in some versions, blue-eyed, and they teach, the ancient Mayan civilization. Quetzalcoatl, interestingly enough, is also referred to as a feathered serpent.
Right.
You find the same legend, again, white-haired, or white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, bearded, Viracocha, teaching the ancient Incans, their civilization. You can go, of course, to any of the Scandinavian and Norse myths. You won't find any lack of blonde-haired, white-skinned, blue-eyed people there. But why is it that we find this legend almost everywhere in such widely dispersed and very, very different resulting cultures? The Japanese, the Mayans, the Scandinavians. This makes, from any standpoint of standard academic history or even comparative religion, this doesn't make any sense. The only sensible way of explaining it is that it really has some common source. And, we find similar ideas with the ancient Sumerians, and we even find white-haired, or white-skinned, blonde-haired people in the ancient Hindu texts doing the same thing. So, whatever this means, I think you may be seeing some sort of covert or occult agenda in play that is directed against the Caucasian race for whatever reason. We certainly, as a race, have been warlike, but no more so or less so than Mongoloids or Orientals or any of the other great racial distinctions within humanity. So I've pondered over this same question and reject that explanation. It's not that we're any more or less warlike than any other racial distinction within humanity. Sadly to say. But I do think that we find some ability within Caucasians to organize civilizations. It's very peculiar, but again, that is an inadequate explanation, because certainly the Orientals have ability to organize civilizations. Just look at the ancient Chinese. So this is a huge mystery. My only guess, and I stress this, Georgianne, it's a guess. My only guess is that they're trying to not only balkanize people and particularly what we would call the white European culture, and to demonize it, but I think they're also attempting really to provoke some sort of backlash.
That, and to breed it out of existence.
And to breed it out of existence. This is the only conclusion that I can come to. Again, these massive social engineering projects, I think, are just doomed to failure at the outset, because, if they're let's say that they are successful in terms of white culture, so to speak, they're certainly not going to be successful in terms of Oriental culture, and so on and so forth. This is just a game plan doomed to failure.
Well, is it possible, Joseph, that the white race is related, or at least a portion of the genetics of the white race are related to the Nephilim? I mean, the angels, as it were.
Well, it could be, in terms of, certainly this would be indicated by these ancient texts. But the problem is, if you examine blood types,
yes,
and how they arise and when they arise, it's really not clear why this should be. And even if it is true that there's, let's grant for the sake of speculation, that there is more of this Nephilimic DNA content within the Caucasian race than in any other, it still does not explain why, then, we're able to interbreed with these other races. It doesn't really give any good account as to why they arose in the first place, if you assume the white race to be original, which I don't think is true either. So, there's just so many nasty problems involved with this. But again, these problems simply exhibit the fact that we are on the cusp of having to reassess everything. And, this kind of puts what I said about the Russians previously into a very interesting light. Because if you examine some of the things that are going on in Russia in terms of this cultural paradigm, it's almost as if they have come to the conclusion that the only hard sciences left are geography and mathematics. Everything else is, for them, up for grabs. So, we're dealing with a lot of details that have a lot of implications, and we're only, in my mind, just beginning to explore them adequately.
Well, you bring up something very interesting there, blood types.
Oh, yes.
I think AB blood is, it's been said that they can't trace it further back than the days of Jesus. Just all kinds of interesting things. Type O seeming to have originated in a certain area. Just on, and it is fascinating.
It is very fascinating, and no one knows why.
Yeah.
This is the bottom line. No one really knows why. And there is somewhere in the literature, if I recall correctly, that the most common blood type among Caucasians is the oldest blood type, or amongst Semitic peoples. But the problem there is, and I think I mentioned this way back when we first started our discussions, is that in some mitochondrial DNA, in, say, like the Navajo or some branches of the Sioux Nation in this country, that the mitochondrial DNA most closely resembles, of all people, white Europeans. And you couple that with some of the ancient Native American Indian legends that they in fact are a people that come from over the sea.
Yes.
Or even the Hopi, they have a peculiarly interesting tradition of their origins, that they had come from previous worlds, and that's their word, and that conjures up this whole interplanetary thing again. So, the standard models, even of that, of an Indian migration over the land bridge in the Bering Strait, and then gradually filtering its way through North America down into South America, that whole thing is just thrown into a cocked hat, not only by this peculiarity of mitochondrial DNA, because it makes no sense on that basis, but also by the fact that, you find the more advanced native Indian cultures, the further south you go, rather than, as you would think, the further north you go. So none of the standard academic stuff makes, to my mind, any rational sense whatsoever. And this is why, I think that when we talked about the paradigm shift in the previous discussion, not only does America have the problem of its two fundamentalisms, namely the revivalist religious one and the agnostic secular one, but it also has such an entrenched academic community that is much less willing to examine any of these questions than, say, their counterparts in the academic community, particularly in Eastern Europe.
Oh, we can't rock the boat.
Oh, we can't rock the boat. We can't upset our funding, and yada, yada, yada.
Right.
We have lost the whole idea of a university being a place for the open exchange and investigation of ideas.
Yes.
American universities nowadays are nothing but institutions designed to preserve a popular dogma.
Yes, and to teach the business of making money
and
from
to teach
that dogma.
Yeah, and to teach the business of making money on it.
Yeah.
So, to my mind, we have a completely fraudulent academic situation in this country. And sadly to say, that fraud is showing terrible signs of creeping into the oldest universities in Western Europe. But, you find a very different academic picture when you move across what used to be the old Iron Curtain into Eastern Europe. You find a very, very different picture because they're very willing to investigate these things and to give serious academic attention to it. So, everything is up for grabs, and unfortunately, we are we are bringing up the rear, I hate to say, in this country.
Well, if we go to Deuteronomy 32, and I'm not in the King James Bible, I'm in a Catholic Bible.
Okay.
It says in Deuteronomy 32, verse 7, think back on the days of old. Reflect on the years of age upon age. Ask your father, and he will inform you. Ask your elders, and they will tell you. Now here's the thing. When the Most High assigned the nations their heritage, when he parceled out the descendants of Adam, he set up the boundaries of the peoples after the number of the sons of God. While the Lord's own portion was Jacob, his hereditary share was Israel. I find that in the King James it does not mention the sons of God. Why is that such a bugaboo for the so-called Christian?
Well, because the doctrine, it's a very, very old doctrine, and you find it in esoteric literature as well. That individual nations, and usually what is meant there is in terms of an ethnic group, a people, a specific culture, like the Slavs or the Teutons or the Celts or so on and so forth, that they have their own angels. Not only, in other words, not only do individuals have guardian angels, so to speak, but whole nations do. and again, you find the whole idea of an angelic hierarchy, kind of a bureaucracy, if you want.
I noticed that.
Yeah, you have this whole idea in some very ancient Christian literature. So, it's not surprising to me that these things are so, and they're part of the general Catholic tradition. But it would be surprising to people who, again, for whatever reason, historically or theologically, have cut themselves off from that. And therefore, any mention of it is going to send them into a tailspin because they think you're talking about demons. Well, in some cases, if you look at the esoteric literature, you might be dealing with something like that because, there's the practice within astrology, for example, of casting what's called a mundane horoscope. In other words, a horoscope not for an individual, but for a nation.
For a nation, yes.
So, things like that can be done, and they do that all the time. It's just that most people are not aware of it.
Yes.
So, this goes way, way back, and again, it's part of that broader tradition where you find within ancient texts particular gods being associated with particular celestial bodies. It's not surprising to me at all. What complicates the picture is when some of these gods, or if you prefer angels, go into revolt. And that implies, and it's very clear in the Sumerian text, that implies revolt of certain regions.
Yes.
So, this again complicates the picture, but it's not a surprising one to me, nor do I find it all that problematical because I've been familiar with it. But if you're not, it's going to be surprising. But all this being said, it's just another one of those areas, that I think we're going to have to go back and do a very careful theological reappraisal as to what our own traditions really might have implied all along. And I don't think we can do that simply by concentrating on the biblical text and, ostrich-like burying our head in the sand of two leather covers in a book. We have to look at other books as well and put things into a huge context.
And in saying that doesn't mean that people need to give up their faith in Jesus.
Oh, no, not at all. No, not at all.
I think there's a reason that a lot of these old texts have been preserved.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And we need to be reading them as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I don't think that, part of the reason I've written these books and sequenced them the way I did, the pyramid books, then the Nazi, and then another pyramid book, and then the Nazis again, and now the Cosmic War, so we're back to the ancient stuff, and the book following that, we're back to the Nazis again. The reason why is that if we look at what was going on back then, we can draw clear parallels as to what is going on now, and particularly since World War II. In my estimation, World War II, particularly with Nazi Germany, opened up some sort of spiritual gate or turned some sort of spiritual corner,
right,
or was some sort of spiritual catalyst. Because, again, remembering the occult background of the Nazis, and, again, the occult and very barbaric practices in ancient times of human sacrifice, the idea has always occurred to me that the Holocaust may have not only been just because of sheer hate for a certain group or groups of people on the part of the Nazis, but that there may have been in place some very sinister occult agenda of human sacrifice in play as well, that, they would never have written down and didn't, but that this may have been in play, because certainly things have not really gotten any better since World War II. And the world changed in such a dramatic fashion with that war, spiritually changed. So I think it's all related, and again, that there are spiritual aspects that we have to wake up to, but we can only wake up to if we undertake this very careful very detailed and very in-depth theological examination, and I am adamant in my opinion that this examination must come from those with traditional Christian theological commitments. It will not be successful from any theological position which adheres to a rejection of tradition as part of its theological outlook. I just don't see that happening in the depth that it needs to.
Well, I know that we are all in for a huge change.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Of knowledge. It's just that too. When we look at this, Joseph, we know that a huge deception is also coming.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think that we need, it's hard to separate out some of these things.
Well, this is the other disturbing aspect of it, because I do believe that much of what I'm talking about can be entered into that scenario of deception. And therefore, to have a clear understanding of these ancient things and their possible modern implications is even more necessary for that reason. I don't think that simply because it can so very easily dovetail into a scenario of deception, I do not believe that this means that some of the things that I'm writing about are untrue or to be rejected because of that. I think rather it means that the deception will be in taking these types of things and twisting them in a spiritual fashion, or if you prefer, and I would certainly prefer the much more accurate term, twisting them in a theological fashion, and saying that there are implications to them that really are not there. And this I think is well underway within the alternative community. You only need to read but a few popular authors when they start talking about this subject, and inevitably you find some offhand comment about, well, this disproves traditional religion, or this disproves Judaism or Christianity, or what have you. I don't think it does so at all, because most of the people making those types of claims, again, are people that are terribly illiterate theologically. They know only a kind of a modern, very watered-down version of Christianity, and many of them know it only in its modern American revivalist form, which is certainly the most visible on the world stage right now. But it is also, in my opinion, the most perverted form. So,
share your opinion.
Yeah, all of this is in play, and this is why, again, I emphasize that for any theological examination to be done, such as I'm calling for, a person would have to be extremely thoroughly well-grounded in patristic theology, in church history, and in medieval theology and philosophy and so on, in order to undertake the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I don't at all think it is ever going to be even possible for people within the revivalist fundamentalist camp from even approaching this with anything like the objectivity that would be needed. For so many of that crowd, the Pope is everything evil, and anything that smacks of the C word, namely Catholic, is ipso facto of the devil. So, that whole crowd, I just, unfortunately, if your listeners are of that crowd, I don't mean to tread on toes or anything of that sort, but I just don't see the kind of effort that I'm talking about coming from them, because as far as I can see, they're only digging their heads deeper and deeper and deeper into the sand.
Well, it's a way of not having to deal with it.
Yes, exactly.
Well, going back to the white man, and particularly the very fair-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, there are so many reports of people during abductions
Yes,
seeing these very tall,
the Nordic type.
yeah, very
rather
good
than
looking,
the gray. Mm-hmm.
yeah, very good looking beings,
Right.
or people, or whatever they are. What is there anything in the other literature about that?
Well, again, I've already referred to some of the ancient legends.
Yes.
But one of the things that I find extraordinarily interesting within contactee literature, particularly the early contactee literature, George Adamski and people of that sort, is that this type, this Nordic type, was almost universally the type that they encountered. The so-called Greys, as far as I can tell, don't seem to enter the literature or the experience until later on down the line, some 20 to 25 years. And what I find very peculiar is that in contact with this Nordic type, there always appears to be this dubious message of fix your planet and fix yourselves, or things are going to get really bad, and we're here to bring you peace, love, enlightenment, and
yeah, you are the chosen one.
Yeah, we're here to be. Yeah, you're the chosen one, and we're here to preach our message of the universal group hug.
Yeah.
Of which I'm extremely skeptical about, because first of all, the messages that are conveyed are so platitudinous and saccharine in their content as to be rather self-evident. We don't need we don't need Nordic space brothers coming down here to tell us these things. We already know them. So I'm very skeptical of this whole contact. But this highlights the fact that in terms of the modern experience, that this is the type that seems to have been latched onto. And, again, going back to this whole ancient context, the whole purpose of my books, and I even mention this very explicitly in the preface to The Cosmic War, is that, there is this, what I call Disney World approach to some of these alternative studies, that wants to see everything about these ancient societies and cultures and technologies in terms of jonquils and daisies, as being this kind of amusement park wonderland of just wonderful things and peace and love and harmony and all of that.
The golden era.
The golden era. But, the fact of the matter is, to assume that approach, or even to imply it, and there are so many alternative researchers out there that imply this but never come right out and say it.
Right.
To assume that approach is just absolutely to ignore what those very ancient texts and legends say.
You're right.
And particularly from that part of the world that I'm concerned with, namely Egypt and Mesopotamia, the texts are not only clear, but they're clear as to the mechanism of the demise of that civilization. It was war, it was fought with horrendously powerful weapons, and it was fought by people, if you want to call them that, who had the morality of insects.
Yeah, alley cats.
Alley cats. That hadn't the slightest concern for life, much less human life.
Right.
And hadn't the slightest concern even with the lives of their own, so to speak, their own compadres in their own pantheon. It's just, to me, silly to propagate this notion that everything was jonquils and daisies back then. It wasn't.
Well, that's that ridiculous. They get that from Plato.
Yeah, I think in part they do. I think in part it's this whole human tendency to romanticize anything that's distant from us in time. It's just, to me, it's just irrational in the extreme to do so. You cannot be looking at the text subjectively and see this.
Well, you can say that again, because that is absolutely true.
Right. And to bring the mythology of the Nordic up to modern times, Well, we all know what nation bought into that mythology big time. And as a result, we had to fight the world's most destructive war, as a result of this whole thing. So, I think the real message is if you're getting visited with messages of love, joy, and peace, consider the messengers, number one, and consider where this sort of thing has led to in the past.
Oh boy, deadly.
Yeah, deadly.
And where does the drive to practice eugenics come from? That is, that's a big issue, even now in our own time.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Well, ultimately, I think it comes from this very dark, occult, if you will, black magic agenda that I think is so deeply buried within much modern politics, because it is nothing more and nothing less than human sacrifice.
Yeah.
And they can come up with whatever fancy names and fancy arguments that they wish for it. But the fact of the matter is that these people are nothing but servants of Moloch.
Yes, you're right.
And I don't care who they are, or what their reasons for advancing it are, their so-called reasons for advancing it are. I just do not see that, put into the very long-term frame that I approach things from, that there's any other conclusion to come to.
Well, Joseph, bringing this down to the same issue, but in another vein, there are millions and millions, many more than 40 million babies
who have
been butchered in this country.
Oh, yes.
In the United States.
Oh, yes.
Over a period of time.
Right.
People who stand for that and, applaud it and think woman has her right and this and that, they're buying. This is massive human sacrifice.
Well, it's not only that, but it is a species of utter irrationality any way one examines it. For example, originally part of the apologetic was to provide some sort of out or some sort of palliative to rape victims who became pregnant, and so on and so forth. I remember, I'm old enough to remember that argument.
Sure.
Well, this is just a complete fiction, because there haven't been 40 million rapes that have resulted in pregnancies.
That's right.
And so then we come to the fetus is a part of the woman's body argument,
right,
which to me is, again, it flies not only in the face of science, but it flies in the face of logic. The logic of the matter is that by, I think it's 6 to 8 weeks of gestation, the human fetus has most of its sexual characteristics in place. It has most of its distinguishable limbs and so on and so forth. So, in the case of a woman carrying a male child, are we to argue then, because it's a part of her body, that she has 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 heads, a vagina, and a penis? No. No one argues that way, because it's an utter absurdity, and everybody knows it. But to hold the mirror up and expose the absurdity of this argument of being a part of a woman's body is absurd. I had a sister that bought into that whole argument, and I told her that it was an absurdity, and she knew it. It's a body within her body, but that's a very different matter. But, on the purely scientific side of things, at the very moment of conception, you are dealing with a unique genetic zygote. You have an absolutely genetically unique individual that is different and distinct from its mother, and for that matter, from its father, unless, of course, it's a clone, which, you wouldn't even require the normal human processes of reproduction for that. So, any way that we slice this again, I can only come to the conclusion that there is some other agenda in play, and it's not simply their agenda of overpopulation and trying to control it. Because if that's the case, then this is a terribly inefficient method, and it's not working. You know?
Right.
So, again, I'm driven back to the idea that whoever is ultimately behind and pushing this hideous agenda is ultimately simply out for human sacrifice. This is the only thing I can the only conclusion that I have really been able to come to after years of vexing my mind about the problem and how to deal with it. This is the only thing I can come to. And it's very interesting to me as someone whose academic background is precisely in patristic theology, that if you read the Roe versus Wade decision and the utterly half-hearted and illiterate attempt of those Masons on the Supreme Court at the time that came out with that stupid decision.
Oh, and she lied about the whole bunch.
The whole thing is a sham from the get-go. But in terms of the actual written opinion, the sources of Christian doctrine that they cite as somehow perhaps providing a moral precedent for their decision were some speculations of Thomas Aquinas, who, of course, is a fairly late figure in terms of Christian history. And even there, it's they're citing someone who hardly would have approved of the uses to which they put his speculation. So on that score, it's illogical. But I can point to traditions from church liturgical tradition and canonical tradition dating from the 2nd century, which say that, upon the general resurrection, those who have been aborted will be the very ones judging those who did it to them.
Wow.
The whole Christian feast of the slaughter of the innocents, let us not forget, occurs the day after Christmas, for those of us familiar with those traditions. And, that was hardly an accidental positioning on the part of the church when that was done, because the whole emphasis there is to point out the hideousness of abortion and Herod's activity and so on and so forth. So again, they were extremely selective when they handed down that decision on which parts of the Christian tradition they wanted to look at, if indeed those illiterate nuts even knew of this stuff, or if they did, had the neuron and synapse lined up long enough for them to make that observation about it. In other words, this whole thing is being done by people with an agenda that was never an objective court to begin with.
Right.
In this respect. It was either an extraordinarily stupid and theologically illiterate court, which I am willing to entertain given the state of this country's judicial system,
yes.
or it was a court that from the outset had made up its mind and had an agenda in place and was waiting for the right case to come along to ram it through. In any way we examine it, this is an abomination,
yes.
Legally, jurisprudentially, historically, from the standpoint of Christian doctrine, from the standpoint of common polity and public good. Any way it is sliced, it makes no sense unless there is this agenda secretly in play for human sacrifice. And it is not for nothing, Georgianne, that I think that these high muckety-mucks with all of their vast billions and their boredom have to get together every year out at Big Sur in California and make mock sacrifices of babies to owls. You talk about the height of irration.
Listen, I don't think those sacrifices are mock at all. I think they're real.
Well, they may be. But whether they are one or the other, for the so-called leaders of the world to be indulging themselves, and that's what it is. It is nothing more than self-indulgence.
That's right.
to do this and supposedly claim to be rational, to me is, if people don't wake up and see these frauds and these nitwits and these clowns and these fascists for the brain-addled, phylogenetically impaired asses that they are,
amen to that.
then, God help us all.
Yeah.
I'm on a roll.
You sure are. Well, it is. If they get some kind of hit from all this blood from the babies, number one, too, they wanted the genetic material from these fetuses to play with in black labs.
Yeah.
They war, blood, sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of thing. And they do get hits from the dark side. The more death, the greater the hits they get.
Well, it has to be some psychology like that behind it, because I can't find any, most people that one encounters, whether they're fairly well read or not, are at least relatively rational and intelligent people.
Right.
And, I have a hard time thinking of people like that going out to Big Sur and doing the stupid, silly things that they do there. And claiming to be the power and the enlightened ones and so on and so forth. They're just nitwits. It's just,
they believe.
Oh, I know they believe.
They believe they are going to kill off a whole bunch of us, and they're going to have their golden world again, and they're going to live forever. And
well, to them I say, read your texts. You've done this before.
Yeah, they have.
It didn't work. It didn't work then. It ain't going to work now.
That's right.
Whether you like it or not, if you're even remotely approaching success, there will be an intervention, as there was then.
That's right.
So, to me, it's just a stupid exercise in futility. And, that's the other point of all these books. You can have all the advanced science, technology, physics, inside track on ancient texts and knowledge that you wish. But the end result is that it gets these people absolutely nowhere.
That's right. That's right. Well, I like to entertain in my mind, Joseph, how God's going to deal with them in the end. I don't think they're going to like it very much.
Well, there is an old tradition that dates back to St. Ephraim the Syrian, 4th century saint. That, maybe it was 5th century, I don't remember right off the top of my head. But anyway, he was an interesting individual. He's one of these desert monks, out there in his hermitage.
Yeah.
But he made an interesting statement, something to the effect that if one's heart is truly filled with the compassion of God, one will even pray for the devil.
Yeah.
And I thought, that was rather arresting to me, because, if anybody needs prayer in this world, it's these poor deluded nuts. Whoever, and we can probably think of some of them by name.
Oh, I'm sure we can.
That if anybody needs to have their hearts of stone turned to hearts of flesh, it's these people.
Well,
and
they're not like us.
Well, maybe they're not like us, but that doesn't preclude praying for them and God working with and in and through them and perhaps giving them those hearts of flesh and putting them in a situation where they might actually change their mind, and quite literally repent. I hold out any possibility, and the reason I'm saying this is that in the Christian world, we tend to look at us versus them.
Right.
And we forget that these people are those for whom Christ died, and therefore that we should pray for them accordingly. If we know who they are and we know their wicked acts, then by golly, pray for them, and specifically about those wicked acts, that they will see what they are doing and repent of them, and quite literally change sides. Just imagine what a tremendous monkey wrench in the works that would be if a lot of them defect.
But do they have the capability, the facility within them to defect? This is going back to the DNA and the genetics and the Nephilim and oh my gosh, that whole thing. Do these people actually have the capacity for that?
Again, let's go back to what we said in the previous discussion.
Okay.
God does not create sin natures. This is one of the biggest deceptions that has entered the Christian community, particularly in the West.
Oh, what about the hybridization?
Well, that too. The point is that I don't think, and this will put me at odds with many who are thinking about these subjects.
Yeah.
I don't think that we can, on any genetic basis, say that a certain class of individual is ipso facto evil, because we have been down this route before with Jews, with blacks, with whatever group that we wish to think of.
Yeah.
I think we have to hold out that God may actually exert some mercy to these types of creations or creatures as well. I'm not condoning the activity.
Right.
I'm simply saying that, okay, if the activity is there, once done, we'd better be very careful about entering into any sort of Manichaean or dualistic worldview which views one segment of humanity as pure or gods and another as not being so. The only...
Well, that's what they do with us because they view
Yes,
us.
I know that's what they do with us, but that doesn't justify us doing it with them.
Right.
And that's not a popular view,
Right.
saying, that we should pray for the likes of the Rockefeller family and some of the ills and evils that they have wrought over the years, or the Rothschilds or any of that. But the fact of the matter is sitting on our duffs and complaining about them isn't going to do any more good either.
and isn't it true, too, Joseph, when you get a lot of people, millions of people, complaining and, saying, oh, I hate those people and this and that, doesn't that agitate it and make it worse?
Well, of course it does.
Okay.
Of course it does. This is why I think, I'm genuinely skeptical of so much that goes on within what I call the American civil religion, or, American fundamentalism or revivalism, or whatever you want to call this absurdity that we see passing itself off as Christianity. Yeah. Because so much of it is founded in footnoted, biblically referenced hatred.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, those people doing it are themselves a part of what they themselves castigate.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know numerous times I've asked listeners to pray for the leaders of the world and to pray for our president.
Yes.
And I'll say, and I know it might make you want to throw up, but you've got to do it. You're commanded to do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And do it sincerely.
Yep. Yep.
And if millions of us got together and did that.
And actually did it.
Yes.
And did it more than in the superficial manner that general intercessory prayer is done in. But be quite specific as to what the requests are.
Yes.
Quite specific. And be agreed upon them. And again, there are, as you know, within the liturgies, the old liturgies of the Roman Church, there were things called litanies.
Yes.
And they could be extraordinarily specific about the things that they were interceding for.
Yes.
And again, if you cut yourself off from the prayers of the church through the ages, you really have cut yourself off in a major way from being able to discern or see any of the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. This is why I find the modern fundamentalist situation such an abomination. Because the people who are practicing it, God bless them in their love and in their sincerity and so on, but they are cutting themselves off from something that ultimately, Proverbs says, do not have any concourse or something to that effect with the fatherless. And I think that means something spiritual. I think it means, you have fathers in the faith and they go back for 2 millennia. And they're not all bound between the leather covers of the New Testament either.
You're right there, too.
So wake up, people.
Well, a lot of times you'll hear various speakers, they will say, well, you accept the new covenant and you're free and you're this and everything's hunky-dory.
Mm-hmm.
And, just walk with God and you're okay.
Mm-hmm. You've got your eternal insurance ticket punched.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Once saved, always saved. I don't think that's exactly true.
Everything. Let's go back to something I said earlier, and again, we're touching on theology that I can't even begin to go into in the detail I would like. But there is a truth to once saved, always saved. But only if you view it in reference to Christ Himself and the fact that He took on, once for all time, perfect and whole human nature.
That's right.
That is the only context in which that phrase or that doctrine makes any sense. Any other construct or doctrine is a doctrine of men, and it occurs much later in the history of Christianity. You will not find any similar such doctrine anywhere in the first 1,000 years of the history or doctrine or teaching of the church. Again, if you cut yourself off from your fathers in the faith, you will come up with any manner of deception. The devil is well versed in Scripture and knows how to use it.
And he has been very busy using it.
And he's been busy using it, especially in the last 1,000 years. Very, very busy.
I agree. Oh my gosh. Well, when we talk about the Nephilim and Satan, Lucifer, Elohim, okay, the word Elohim, people say, and the Trinity, people will say, well, you cannot have more than one God in heaven. Okay? And the God in heaven is the Father of Jesus Christ, Yahweh. In the Pseudepigrapha, Enoch says there are two powers in heaven. One is God and the other is Satan. Or, why are these kind of things, Joseph, not discussed in detail and laid out in the open and talked about so people can get and grasp a real and deeper understanding of the terminology, for one thing?
Well, part of the answer lies in the fact that if one starts talking about the Book of Enoch, this would make even traditional theologians from older Christian traditions very uncomfortable. Again, this is something that is part of this reexamination, I think, has to be done.
Yes.
Okay? So that's one reason that it's not done. The other reason lies simply in the ambiguity of the Greek word that's used for heaven, which is uranos. It can mean literally, celestial heavens, like, the Milky Way galaxy or things of that sort. Or it can mean heaven in the spiritual sense. So it's a rather ambiguous term, and you have to be kind of careful when it's used. There are other terms used for purely physical heavens, like Ayer and so on and so forth in the Greek. But that's part of it. You'd have to have some facility with the Greek, which, again, most of these popular preachers and so on, or even people that have been through seminary, at best they get 1 to 2 years of Greek. But Greek is an extraordinarily subtle language, and you really have to kind of immerse yourself with it for a number of years before you can appreciate it for its subtlety. So that's part of it. So I think in this instance we can write it down to rather innocent causes. But again, we cannot persist in that innocence. This evaluation of things has to be undertaken. It will literally be forced, one way or another,
yes,
on Christians to do. Simply by dint of the fact that there are so many people working in this alternative area of research that inevitably it's going to reach a state of critical mass that theologians, whether they're good ones or bad ones or capable ones or uncapable ones, are going to have to be dealing with it.
Agreed. When throughout Scripture where they use the term Elohim, is it always plural?
Yes, that's just the grammatical construction of the Hebrew language. It is always that way. That I-im ending, the I am ending, is the plural of 3 or more. So whenever you encounter it, whether it be in the term Elohim or in the term Nephilim or the term Rephaim or so on and so forth, that is always its grammatical. Yes, it's always a plural.
Because I've heard scholars say you have to look at how it's used in different places and then determine. And yet I was taught that it's always plural.
Yeah, well, grammatically and linguistically it is. They're correct that you have to be careful of context.
Yes.
But, one has to be extremely careful even with scholars anymore, and I'm going to climb way out on a limb here. There has been such a decline in the standards of scholarship, and more importantly, of the standards of theology.
Yes.
That scholarly arguments today oftentimes would have been laughed out of court 2 to 3 centuries ago.
Well, there's a decline in the IQ, for heaven's sake.
Well, yes. This is, it's all part of the same thing. If the culture at Broad is being dumbed down, then this is taking place in every discipline that one can imagine, especially in theology, and for very deliberate and easily seen reasons, and from a very easily point in time, this begins to occur. So one has to be aware of that is in play. But the other thing is, academic theologians love to dispense with arguments or opinions they do not like.
Oh, sure.
By what I call the argument of the footnote. In other words, they put on a tremendous display of specialized knowledge that one is supposed to bow before, because one, oftentimes won't really have the background even to appreciate what they're saying. So, they make this display of formalized academic argument, and that's supposed to dispel the whole problem that they're dealing with. And I can think of a few by name that resort to this tactic. And that's what it is. It's a tactic. It's like the preacher who's constantly quoting Bible verses at inappropriate moments. It's a display of their knowledge, and it's a tactic of intimidation, which I've never been impressed with in either case that it's exercised, the academic one or the fount of biblical knowledge version. But one has to be aware that this is a common thing. I think that we referred earlier to criticisms leveled against Zecharia Sitchin because of his translations and just outright mistranslations in places. Well, this is done in aid of dismissing everything that Sitchin says.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, Sitchin says some rather profound things. He has some rather profound legitimate insights, and you simply cannot dispel them by this display of technical knowledge. The general idea of what he's getting at won't go away.
Yeah.
And, anyone can quibble over translations. I've done my own translation academic work and know that things can be leveled against the way I've translated things and perhaps even why I've done so.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that things can be weighed in for them and why I've done so. That's a game that anyone can play. But to get involved with it is really a case of trying to disprove the forest over, quibbling about some particular tree. And that's the standard game. And this is why when I wrote The Cosmic War, I did not rely on my own translations of any of those texts. I relied on pre-existing, accepted academic translations. Because to me, the argument that I'm making is not about the forest or the trees of translation. It's about the forest that they paint.
Yes.
So, this is a game that's going on, and unfortunately it's going on big time in this country, and that's why people will never really be inclined to look at these things calmly and objectively until it's forced on them. And then, in that situation, people are hardly predisposed to look at things calmly and objectively. They tend to do so in a hurry and skip certain steps and fall prey to kind of wishy-washy thinking. So again, this is something that is such a big scenario and has so many interesting implications that go out in any number of ways. But I'm just saying all this to kind of alert your listeners to be very careful of this kind of academic argumentation. It's not to say that it's invalid. It's simply to say be very careful of how they use it. Have they really addressed the big picture when they make these quibbling points? And in many cases, they have not. They have very cleverly deflected our attention away from it.
True. Oh my gosh. I've got another question here.
Mm-hmm.
Mathematically, when we talk about DNA and the combinations of DNA,
mm-hmm.
and everybody is unique,
mm-hmm.
okay, is there a point, a saturation point, to where the DNA, it's used up all its differences?
Oh, good question. I don't know. I've never run any sort of calculation like that to figure out. I don't even know if anyone else has. I certainly think there may be some sort of ability of DNA to reproduce under peculiar circumstances some very peculiar results. We've all had the experience of seeing people that look like family or even look like us or very similar to us, and yet they're complete strangers.
Right.
We've all had some sort of experience like that.
Kind of like seeing someone and they look like your twin.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that's possibly in play here. But the fact of the matter is, with 6 billion people on this planet, running a mathematical calculation of that sort, you're still ending up with so many potential, theoretically possible combinations that it just appears to be limitless and inexhaustible. It's just, It's just one of those things.
Joseph, a scientist recently claims that he created a synthetic chromosome. What can be done with that?
Well, I don't honestly know. I'm not familiar with the story, and I'd have to look at it and see exactly what he's talking about. It may be that he's just done some very clever and very complicated splicing and so on and so forth. I don't honestly know what you could do with it until I actually saw the story and what he's claiming for it.
Well, it certainly raises the hair on the back of my neck.
Well, yes, it does mine too. You know, this whole area raises the hair on the back of my head, as does the whole area of nanotechnology. You know,
right.
The ability to engineer things at that small of a scale. You know, it was some years ago that I think it was IBM spelled out its corporate initials with 25 xenon atoms.
Oh, gee.
You know, and then the real topper was when Bell Laboratories actually constructed an atom.
Yes.
So, you know,
I remember.
You know, when we get to this point, especially combining technologies of that sort with genetics, you know, the mind just begins to boggle at all the implications.
In Revelation, when they talk about the mark of this beast, and no man will be able to buy or sell without this mark, is this a mark on every individual? Is this definitely a mark on countries that I think won't be allowed to trade if they do not cave into certain demands? But how do we, you know, people are saying, well, this RFID chip that's the mark. I think it's a lot more than that.
Oh, I think it's very, very much deeper than just that. I think that there is a technological component. I've always inclined to the opinion that it's an individual thing. But, you know, there's every possibility that this may not be the case. It may be, as you say, some sort of mark on a nation or something. You know, we just really don't know. But I do think that it's a spiritual thing as well.
Yeah.
I think somehow that it's a mark on the individual soul.
By a decision that they've made?
Possibly by a decision that they've made or a covenant that they've entered into. I don't know, but it's something spiritual as well. You know, it has to be. And again, there are those who just kind of narrow-mindedly look at certain technological developments, and I'm not saying that they're not right to do so, but I think other possibilities need to be considered, and we've been very slack in doing so. And that to me is another aspect that I find so disturbing.
Well, if it has a spiritual dimension, and I believe it does, it might be those that turn against God and join Lucifer.
Well, it's got to be something like that.
Yeah.
You know, that to me is clear that this is more than just a technological thing, if indeed it is technological at all. Again, I incline to the opinion that it probably is, because the whole thrust of my works is to show that there is this peculiar interface in ancient times between the technological and the spiritual.
Oh, yeah.
You know, this is rather more of a modern division that we have that really doesn't make a great deal of sense in terms of the way the ancients looked at things. So yeah, you know, the whole sacramental idea within the Christian tradition indicates this conjunction of the physical and the spiritual. So it has to be, to my mind, something of that nature that's in play here, a kind of a false sacrament, if you will.
Yeah. Ooh. Okay, what when going back to the Nephilim, and their descendants, it would seem that their descendants would be those that would be involved in science, deeply involved in science. That would be the genetic proclivity. Advanced, and then we look at Germany, and I'm not trying to offend anybody, but the blonde, blue eyes, very white skin of the German. I'm wondering if there's some connection there, because look at the science. Oh my gosh, that's come out of Germany.
Yes, well, that may very well be, and it's clear from books like Enoch and so on that these offspring of the Nephilim were involved in scientific and technological areas. So I don't discount your idea there. As far as the Germans go, it's really, if we stop and think of it, going back to your observations about Caucasians and so on, if you stop and think of the vast amount of modern science that has been done, if we go back to the Middle Ages, the Muslims were doing a great deal of scientific work and so on and so forth. It's always, and for the last 1,000 years, has been done up until the end of World War I, when it begins to spread, of course. That whole period, you find these astonishing scientific advances being done by that particular race. Now, whether that's a racial thing or it's a peculiarity of the fact of and influence of Christian culture on science, which I think has a great deal to do with it as well, I don't know. Certainly, the fact that we see so much science taking place now, in India or in China or in Japan is an indicator against that idea. But the fact that it was done and that most of the paradigms of our science were done in terms of the white Caucasian race doing it, it raises some eyebrows. Does it mean anything? Again, this is another area for further study. I don't think anyone would rationally conclude that white people are better at science than the Japanese or the Chinese, because this is clearly not the case. But in terms of the historical accidents, was it purely cultural? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think, again, we have to have minds open enough to be willing to explore and entertain all sorts of questions, and in the process of doing so, the questions themselves will probably undergo modification. They usually do. But, I just don't think that there's anything, that there's really, I kind of take the modern Russian view that the most solid hard sciences we have are geography and mathematics, and everything else that we thought sacred and thought we knew, we have to take a new skeptical eye to.
Well, it just seems like the German makeup has been to use these weapons.
Yes.
Whereas the Japanese have not.
Right.
The Russians have when it comes to certain types of weapons, chemical. There just seems to be certain proclivities that harken back to things of old that are pretty darn scary.
Well, this is true. It's most of the modern technology of warfare is, like it or not, comes in one form or another from the Caucasian race ultimately, and it has spread elsewhere. we can only but think of World War I and the use in World War I of the first weapon of mass destruction and poison gas and all of this stuff, and it is disturbingly true. But again, does this indicate something about the genetic structure? I don't know. These are such deep questions, and I don't think anybody, at least in the public literature, is really addressing any of it, as far as I can find. And humanity being humanity, I don't restrict destructive use of these things to the white people. Certainly, I wouldn't put it past the Chinese leaders to use this stuff, and I certainly wouldn't put it past the leaders of India, if their backs were to a wall, to use it. So.
But there's other weaponry that is so much more sophisticated. When we talked about vibrating stuff.
Right.
There is a stock of weapons that will not, it will not put radiation in the earth.
Right.
And it doesn't make sense to me, Joseph, why anyone would want to blow off radioactive weapons.
Well, it doesn't make sense to me either, but, if we're playing around with people that think that they've got to get rid of 95% of the world's population, then it makes a great deal of sense for them to be entertaining the use of these things.
Well, where are they going to go?
Well, this is the fly in their ointment, because uncorking that particular genie, once it's uncorked, you don't put it back into the bottle.
That's right.
And, the old adage is, if you throw the dice of war, be prepared for the unexpected. So no matter how much planning these people can do, there's always going to be something that will go wrong. There will be some unanticipated effect, regardless of what it is. And, if there's anything that is staying their hand, it's probably that realization. They haven't got everything doped out well enough yet, I don't think, for them to really be entertaining it just yet. But you're right, there are other weapons that they could use and that they probably have, and that when the time is appropriate, they'll probably use them. Humanity being what humanity is, when we have a toy, we want to play with it. And
I think they played with it in Indonesia.
Yes, they probably did. I would agree with you.
Very terrible.
Yep.
Do we have any evidence that the Archangel Michael is Jesus?
Well, there have always been schools of Gnosticism and of interpretation that try to, you have the Johannine sect that still exists that thinks that the real Messiah is John the Baptist and all of this stuff. I don't think that there is any sound basis within any sort of good evidential tradition for the view that he's one and the same as the Archangel Michael. I just really don't. To make those kind of claims, you really have to start digging into some of the various Gnostic sects and even more importantly, some of the more modern secret societies to start getting doctrines like that.
I agree with you. It's just I've heard people say that.
Oh, yeah, it's out there. It's one of the many strange things out there that the Bible and Bible-only religion has come up with,
Yeah, that's right.
It's just not in play for me.
Thank you. Okay, I wanted to ask you also, acoustics and levitation.
Right. Oh, yes.
Okay. What about that? And what about these black crystals and the dilation effects of them in local space?
Right. Well, one of the things that I mentioned throughout the Giza Death Star books is that you have these traditions from all over the world about ancients being able to levitate and move things that were extraordinarily heavy objects by means of sound. You have traditions from Tibet, quite recent stories, in fact, from Tibet that involve this sort of acoustic levitation. You have similar traditions from ancient Egypt. I believe that there are even a couple of instances from Sumer. And very interestingly, if you go to Easter Island, where you find those very peculiar, huge stone heads, if you talk to the natives there, they have traditions about those things having been moved into place by the priests using sound. Excuse me. You have similar traditions amongst the Inca. Pardon me. And in each of these cases, what I find interesting here is that, again, we appear to be in the presence of a lost science of sound. That, if the lamas of Tibet are saying it, that's one thing. But if they're saying it, and the ancient Egyptians are saying it, and the Sumerians are saying it, and the Incans are saying it, and the people on Easter Island, wherever they came from, are saying it, then we're in the presence, again, of something that probably has some basis, in fact, long ago, and again, it's a lost science. And that whole science, as we've mentioned in our previous discussions, is this idea of acoustical waves, so to speak, in the medium or fabric of space-time itself, as being areas of rarefaction and compression, which is basically acoustic. If all of this is true, then yes, I think that these horrific ancient weapons were based in part on this whole idea. And in the Cosmic War, I talk about another thing that is talked about in the ancient Egyptian texts as a weapon. It's called the sound eye. And to me, that's very suggestive, because the sound part is obviously acoustic, and the eye part is obviously electromagnetic, So we have all of these allusions to this lost science. Now, you're talking about the black crystals there. That's a speculation that I entertained in the Giza Death Star for what I think may have been a speculative basis for some of this technology, because crystals are not only piezoelectric. In other words, they not only give off little packets of light under certain conditions of stress, but it's also been found very recently that another property of crystals is that they give off phonons, not photons, which are little packets of light, but phonons, which are little packets of sound.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things I speculate on, then, is that they may have found some sort of property or been able to manufacture some sort of crystal which had almost superconductive properties. In other words, able to trap electromagnetic energy at extremely high rates of rotation. And one property of superconductors, when you do that, is they create a kind of a magnetic bubble around themselves. They always appear white because they reflect light. Nothing gets through. If they were absorbing all frequencies of light, they'd look black.
Yes.
So, I call them black crystals because, what I'm saying is that they're trapping all this light, and then they have this bubble effect, which makes them kind of appear white. But, the interesting thing is, once I entertain that speculation, then you get into the scientific literature, and you find out these very peculiar properties of crystals that have come to light, or even, for that matter, very peculiar properties of superconductors. And in the book I'm researching now, which is one book beyond the one that's at the publisher,
right.
I'm researching some of these new areas of material science, and they're just, again, it's just absolutely breathtaking what's going on. But you'd never hear about it in your standard high school physics course or your standard college physics course, because these things, again, are off the books in the sense that they're out in the open, but you'd have to know where to look to find them.
Kind of like a black ops thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Hide in plain sight.
Hide in plain sight. That's the name of the game. You just really have to know where to look.
If they have a dilation effect
Uh-huh.
in local space?
Uh-huh.
Okay, what might that mean?
Well, again, let's take the case of a superconductor when we have an electric current that quite literally is, so to speak, frozen inside the superconductor and just running in perpetuity. One of the things that this does is, like I said, it creates kind of a little magnetic bubble, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, anytime we're involving such extremely high rotation and these types of bubbles, what we're really doing is creating tiny little torsion effects, these little folds and ripples on the fabric of space-time. You know, my analogy of ringing the aluminum can again. And if that's the case, then you're dealing with really very minute little dilations in time, little fluctuations in the normal flow of time. Because again, what's time? Time is measured by motion. And frequency and so on and so forth. So in a superconductor, this is what is happening. It's compressing it, so to speak. So if we can kind of imagine for a moment a technology that would allow us to magnify that effect to an extraordinary degree, we're creating these kind of folds and pleats in time. We're dilating it. We're speeding it up or slowing it down, depending on the effect that we're producing. But yes, I think all of this, again, you know, there's a sufficient solid theoretical basis in science for these things to happen, and it's been around since 1928. You know, with Einstein's first unified field theory paper, in which, you know, sitting squat in the middle of it as kind of its centerpiece is this whole idea of torsion. So it again is an incomplete theory, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an engineerable one. So, you know, I think quietly and off the books, this is really what's been the effort. They've been pursuing this stuff. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Oh, what a world. Well, you know, on a much smaller scale. You know, in mythology, when you read about Thor throwing his thunderbolts and his lightning bolts,
right?
I think of the taser.
Well, you know, I get into this in the Cosmic War to a great extent. I devote a whole chapter to this idea of plasma cosmology and the lightning or lightning weapons of the gods, you know, and point out that very large planetary features in the local celestial neighborhood, both on the moon and more importantly on Mars, bear all the evidence of having been created by means precisely of gigantic plasma electrostatic discharge arcing to the surfaces of those bodies. So, you know, again, it's very interesting that the mythological texts refer to this activity as the result of weaponry.
Yes.
And, you know, in my reading, this is not a metaphor.
Right.
This is something that takes place in the context of an actual war, and therefore in the context of an actual technology.
Well, we sure have a lot to look forward to, don't we?
Oh, yes. One way or another.
It is just, I'll tell you, gee. I mean, it's beyond the pale of anything else that anybody could even think of
yes,
studying.
I agree.
You know? I mean, it's just, there's no end to the depths of it.
Well, yes, the implications spin out in so many directions and in so many levels and numbers that it's really kind of staggering when you get right down to it. And this is why I insist that any theological evaluation of these implications has to be done very carefully, very precisely, in a very coordinated and orderly fashion, because you know, this is too important to go at haphazardly.
No fooling. Wow. Well, you are doing a magnificent work in these areas. It's everybody listening. Get the books. God only knows if these books are going to be available in the future.
That's another consideration.
You're not kidding, Joseph. I mean, these are hot. They're dynamite. Thought-provoking. Oh, my goodness. It will open your mind. The first one, the Giza Death Star. The sequel is the Giza Death Star Deployed. And then we have, in the first trilogy here, the Giza Death Star Destroyed. And then you will absolutely want to read Reich of the Black Sun, and you will want to read the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. You're going to just have to read The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts. Now, call Adventures Unlimited Press at 1-800-718-4514. That's 1-800-718-4514. And when you call, say hi to Jerry. They also have a 24-hour credit card ordering line, and that number is 1-815-253-6390. That's 815-253-6390. And also go to the Bite Show, go to the library. You will see Joseph P. Farrell's name. Click on it, and his page opens up with the Cosmic War files that we have been working on. And go to Joseph's website, GizaDeathStar.com. You can email Joseph. Remember to put whatever you put in the subject line, put it all in caps, and make it intelligent, please. Time is very short, folks. The email address is vardas3@aol.com. And Vardas is V as in Victor, A-R-D as in David, A-S, the number 3, and then the @ at AOL.com. And we'll be back with Joseph in the near future, God willing. I hope so. And I want to say, Joseph, God bless you.
You too.
Many times.
You too.
Oh, thanks for the work that you're doing and making available to everybody.
And thank you for the work that you're doing.
Oh, my.
Making it available to everybody.
Well, you are a real pleasure to work with, I'll tell you.
Well, thank you. It's mutual feeling.
Oh, thank you. And everybody, get the books. I'm not kidding. Get them while you are able to get them. Word to the wise, okay? And God bless everyone out there listening. This is Georgianne Hughes with Joseph P. Farrell, researcher extraordinaire, signing off for tonight. Good night, everybody.
Are we